Is it still worth moving to Alberta? I made a video about this exactly 1 year ago, but so much has changed since then. We have a lot to unwrap, so let's get at it right now. All right, so being from Alberta, born and raised, obviously that gives me a little bit of bias, but every once in a while, like this fella here, Conrad, say hi.
Hi.
I run into it. He lives in Kelowna and he's seriously considering moving to Alberta. So don't take it from me. Why would you consider moving to Alberta?
Well, price is one thing. Like, it's getting ridiculously expensive in British Columbia. Just the taxes and like the super carbon tax they have there and everything else. As a person from Kelowna, I would seriously consider moving here. There's some good reasons to be here.
Totally. Well, yeah, and the cost of living is a big one that I always talk about, and especially in this video and other videos, because it just makes sense for that as well. The cost of living in Alberta, especially with housing, which is one of our biggest single personal expenses, makes so much more sense. Like, what does an average house in Kelowna cost?
Ridiculous. Like, they're $1 million plus. And I remember we moved up there. We bought our house. We moved from Vancouver in 2000 when you could buy a condo in Vancouver for $200,000 with a view of the alley.
Wow.
You could buy a whole house in Kelowna for $200,000. So we made that move with a young family. It's not just the price of the homes, just little things. They all add up.
Yeah,
it all makes sense to be.
Well, can you imagine, like, if you're a younger person especially, so you're one of the lucky ones, you bought a long time ago, so you're probably sitting on a significant amount of equity, which is another thing that I talk about.
Yeah.
But can you imagine starting out right now, especially with interest rates where they are at, getting $1 million or more than $1 million mortgage at 5-6% interest and rising?
Well, so
that's scary.
So we're fortunate. Our kids all have common sense. We've got 3, boy, girl, boy. They all moved to Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
I got 2 boys here in Edmonton. I got 1 daughter in Calgary. And you know what? The economics was right on par for them.
Well, you know what they say, BC, bring cash. Thank you so much, Conrad.
All right, pleasure.
Thanks for your time.
Carry on.
Take care. All right, first things first, deciding to uproot yourself or your family from outside Alberta and move to Alberta is a very big decision, and nobody on YouTube, especially me, can make that decision for you. I do try to be as transparent and honest as possible because I'll be the first to say and admit that Alberta is far from perfect. Nowhere is perfect, and especially Alberta, but it's a pretty good spot to live. So let's start with the first obvious change from the video that I made last year, which is I'm actually in the same spot that I ended that last video, which I'll link right here, and that is the weather. Alberta weather can be, especially in the winter, can be wildly unpredictable. There's a saying in Alberta that if you don't like the weather, just wait 15 minutes. So when I made that video last year, there was no snow on the ground, this lake wasn't frozen, there was geese still here flying in the air. They were on their way out of Alberta, but they were still here, whereas now it's a lot different. Today is quite warm, it's +4 degrees. However, the beginning of November was a rude awakening to winter. That literally the day after Halloween, it dropped to like -20 or 25. We had a huge snow dump, which is what you see right now. So I always tell people who are thinking about coming to Alberta, be prepared, the weather can suck. Now, one of the strongest cases for starting or building a life here in Alberta is the cost of living, especially when it comes to housing, which we'll talk about first, because that is typically people's single biggest expenses. Now, that has not changed over the last 12 months. Alberta is still quite affordable, especially when you compare major markets like Calgary and Edmonton to, say, Vancouver or Toronto. With that comparison, Alberta is a very attractive option, again, whether you're renting or buying. But buying a home, for example, Edmonton is not only one of the most affordable cities in all of Canada, but also in all of North America, which is pretty crazy. One of the major changes over the last 12 months when I made that last video is the interest rate rise, which is a result of the inflation, which I'm sure everyone is well aware of. We'll talk about inflation later, but let's just talk about interest rates for now. Let's say you're considering buying a home and you're in Vancouver or Toronto. You're one of the fortunate few that is able and in a position to do so, because not everyone is, unfortunately. But let's say you are, and you're considering a $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, $1 million plus mortgage at 5-6% interest rates, and who knows how high they're going to go. That is a huge expense compared to, say, Edmonton or Calgary, where you can get a very nice home for $400,000, $450,000. The difference of 5-6% on $400,000 versus $1 million is quite a lot. Now, if you're somebody that owns their home already, especially if you're in Vancouver or Toronto, and especially if you've owned that home for a long time, you're likely sitting on a significant amount of equity. And this is where things get interesting because a lot has changed, but also nothing has changed. Now, in that last video, November 2021, I don't have a crystal ball, by the way, nobody does, but in that video, I made a call that Vancouver and Toronto housing markets must be near the top or the peak of the market. Little did I know how accurate that call would be, because fast forward to spring, summer of 2022, they essentially did peak and now are on the decline. Now, this is not good news if you bought your home last year, because you're likely not in a positive equity position or maybe underwater. But if you bought your home 5, 10, 15 years ago, that's where it gets really interesting, because you've ridden this huge wave of house price appreciation and you're likely sitting on a lot of equity, like a lot, like almost like cashing in a lottery ticket if you were to sell. And that's where things get interesting, because the case I made in that last video is if you cash in that lottery ticket, and you come to Alberta, or you can say buy a house cash or get a very small mortgage on it if you don't want to put all that money down like a lot of people have done, you can have all this extra income or disposable income to do whatever you want. Even if the weather sucks, you can just fly away and go to Phoenix or California for the winter. Now, one of the concepts that I talked a lot about in that last video that hasn't changed at all is market cycles and timing. Now, nobody can time a market because nobody has a crystal ball, but even though it appears like Vancouver and Toronto have peaked, don't feel like you've missed out. If you were to sell now, you're still selling near the peak, and if you've owned your home for a long time, you're likely cashing in on a lot of equity, which gives you a lot of opportunity to start or build a life in Alberta. You could basically buy a house for cash or have little to no mortgage, and with all that extra income, just think of the cool things you can do in life, like travel and experience things. I definitely think it's worth considering if, especially, you're somebody who has owned a home for a long time and has a lot of equity in Vancouver or Toronto. So the last thing about housing, and we'll move on, is I think you need to really consider the opportunity that you potentially have by relocating to Alberta, especially if you're younger and starting out. Think of the life that you can build here, the wealth, the equity you can build here, because you're not spending your entire paycheck to keep a roof over your head, whether you're renting or buying. With all that extra disposable income, you can travel and go see the world. You can invest in the stock market and build your retirement if you want. You can buy a house if you want. You can invest in rental properties if you want. You can just do so much more. You have so much more opportunity ahead of you. All right, the other big change from last year, and I made that video last year, is inflation. Inflation has been running wild over the last 12 months, which everybody is well aware of because it's affecting everything. So other than just housing, that's where I think it still makes a lot of sense to move to Alberta, because gas prices, for example. Now, I looked this morning online. In Toronto, gas is hovering about, at the time of this recording anyways, hovering around about $2 a liter. Vancouver is hovering around $1.60. Here in Edmonton, it's hovering around $1.28. So even though we're not sheltered from inflation in Alberta, we aren't feeling the pinch with it as much as other places in the country are, especially when it comes to gas prices. Kind of a funny story when it comes to cost of living not related to housing is my brother and sister-in-law. They actually did the opposite of what I think should happen, is they left Alberta and went to Ontario, but they didn't have a choice because it was for a job relocation. Anyways, their dog unfortunately got sick and needed surgery, and when they got the quotes from the vets there, they could not believe how expensive it was. And they're pretty familiar with vet bills because their dog has been to vets here at home in Alberta. So just for fun, they called some vets in Alberta, and for the exact same procedure, it was thousands of dollars less. So much so that they were able to fly their entire family of 4 to Alberta to not only visit family while they're here anyways, but then have their dog get the surgery and then fly back to Ontario. It was still cheaper, which is crazy. Now, Alberta is far from perfect, and I will be the very first to admit that. I actually talk a lot about that in this video right here, the 5 pros and cons of living in Alberta. Now, I might seem biased because I do live here in Alberta and I'm born and raised in Alberta. However, I did live outside of Alberta for a couple years. I actually lived in Vancouver, so I experienced what it's like to live there and then come back to the promised land. And I'm quite certain that I would not have been able to build the life I have for my family and I here in Alberta than I would have been able to there. Now, if your plans of coming to Alberta include include buying a house here. I am a licensed real estate professional in Alberta with RE/MAX Excellence, and I would love to have the privilege and honor to be able to help you or answer any questions that you have with the process. Call me, email me, text me, however you're comfortable communicating. My contact information will be in the description below. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. I also have a video about the top 5 cities in Alberta coming out, so make sure you subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you in the next video.